Well, good morning. Welcome to another edition of Frosty's Projects. Today I'm going to be changing a universal joint on my 2001 Ford Expedition XLT. A little bit of backstory. I've been having a weird vibration. It followed the speed of the vehicle, but not the RPM of the motor. So I knew it was something in the drivetrain. I don't know if you can see it from there, but I've had a little bit of funny wear on this front tire. So I thought it was a wheel bearing going out. It's not unusual with a wheel bearing because it doesn't hold the wheel exactly where it's supposed to be. You can get some odd wear patterns, and this is the corner that it felt like the vibration was coming from. So I went ahead and I jacked the vehicle up. This was a couple days ago, and I checked for play in the wheel, and I didn't have any. I'll demonstrate what that looks like. If you grab the wheel with the vehicle off the ground, which this one is, I've jacked the vehicle up. If you grab it front to rear and give it some twist, if you feel any kind of play, not just what's in the steering, but a kind of a clunk, 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 clunk play, that could be a tie rod end. If you have it top to bottom, it could be a ball joint. If you have both, it's usually a pretty good indication that you've got a wheel bearing going out. Another indication on a wheel bearing, although it's not universal, is your ABS sensor is oftentimes, and in this case absolutely is, integrated into your front wheel bearing. So if you've got a wheel bearing going out, the metal particles from the bearing starting to disintegrate will clog up that sensor and cause an ABS light. I didn't have one, but the two are not mutually exclusive. You can have one without the other. So I went in and I checked, and I was solid in the front end. I thought maybe it was a CV joint. I looked underneath the front end, and that front axle on this side looks brand new. So I climbed underneath it, grabbed the front drive shaft, and it's definitely a bad U-joint. So I went ahead and I jacked the vehicle up. Although I can work underneath an Expedition being four-wheel drive comfortably without jacking it up, it makes more room if it is. Plus, if I need to spin that drive shaft to get to the fasteners to get the drive shaft out, I can do that with the front wheels off the ground. So I've safely jacked the vehicle up. I've got it on jack stands, and let's get underneath it and see what we've got. Okay, so here we are underneath my Ford Expedition. A little light on the subject. This is the front of the vehicle. There's my front differential axles coming out either side. This is the drive shaft right here, coming back and headed towards the transfer case in the back. See if that gets into focus. There we go. There's the transfer case in the back. So first thing I did when I came underneath here, see if I can keep light on it. Okay, so here we are. I've got 3 of the 4 bolts out. I've got 1 left. You'll notice I added an index line, which probably isn't a big deal. These drive shafts are balanced. You can see there's balance weights right here. I don't think there's a big difference. I don't think you really have to index this drive shaft, but just for grins, I went ahead and did it. So we've got this last bolt we're going to pull out. To break these loose, because they're so tight, I had to use a small pry bar, aka a screwdriver, in here and up against the bell housing to keep the drive shaft from spinning. Obviously you could drop this down and put the front wheels on the ground so it won't spin, but then you can only get to a couple bolts at a time. Then you have to jack it back up and turn it and put it back down. I just prefer to use a small pry bar, aka a Craftsman screwdriver. So let's see if I can take this last bolt out while videotaping without dropping this drive shaft on my head. I make no guarantees. This could get kind of funny. There's a better shot. It's getting pretty loose now. There we go. Okay, this last bolt. And that does come down. Clears the frame. Come to the back. A little luck, this will slide right out of the transfer case just by sliding it forward on its splines. Actually, this has an expansion joint. That's what that rubber piece is. This could be bolted at the back end as well. So let me do a little more investigating and we'll get back at it. Okay, so here we are back at the transfer case end of this drive shaft. Headed forward, comes back here underneath this cross member. There's this shield which mounted up with 2 screws There's one, there's two. So I had to pull it out of place to see what was going on. And now that this shield is out of the way, you can clearly see on this flange where it connects to the transfer case is 4 more bolts. It doesn't just slide in to the transfer case on a yoke like I was hoping. So now we've got 4 more bolts, just like the ones at the front, back here at the rear, that we need to break loose and get disconnected, and then the drive shaft will come out. Cross your fingers. Okay, one more quick clip where I'm about to pull the last bolt out of this aft U-joint. You can see I've got a socket on here with an extension going underneath this cross member to get to my ratchet out here. It's the only way I could get a socket on here with enough leverage. I mean, these bolts are out in the open, exposed to the elements, you know, day in and day out. So there's a fair bit of corrosion. They're kind of stuck. A little bit of penetrating oil probably wouldn't hurt me, but I'm almost done now. So if you're wondering how I got to these bolts, you can see it's a deep socket with a long extension underneath that cross member all the way back here. So that's the setup I had to do in order to get to these fasteners. Okay, so a couple quick lessons learned before we look at this drive shaft. One, penetrating oil on these bolts would have been very, very helpful. Certainly, if you have a buddy with a lift, yeah, make sure he's a good buddy, because that would have been much more convenient. Also, as it turns out, before I could get to these back bolts and get really good leverage to get them disconnected, it was far easier for me to resuspend the front end of the drive shaft. Just 2 bolts in it real quick to kind of hold it in place. That made it a lot easier. So if I had started with the back half first at the transfer case, it would have gone much more easily, and then done the front afterwards. But hopefully, yeah, you can see this is a good U-joint here. You'll see that it's designed to swivel so that it can turn angles. But each of these cups, there's a cup on the end of these. Here's a new one like this with these cups that fit on here with little bearings inside. There shouldn't be any play in this at all, and there's not. That's a good tight U-joint. There's no play whatsoever. If you turn this around and look at the front end, I'm sure you can see that. Yeah, absolutely. That was the vibration I was feeling. Wow, you can actually see some damage here on the side of the drive shaft where this thing was flopping around some. So this thing took quite a beating. You can see this end cap is completely worn all the way through. So that was my vibration. All right, and hopefully you're going to be able to see me work on this. I'll try to stay out of the camera angle. There are these little clips that go at the end of each one of these cups. They're the new ones. Typically when you get a replacement universal joint, you'll get new ones. That's what these clips look like right there. So we've got new ones of those. Just to make sure these are going to come out clean, I'm going to go ahead and spray them with a little penetrating oil. There we go. And probably the easiest way to get these out is going to be a pair of needle nose pliers. Let's see what kind of luck we have with them. Stay. So you should be able to get in here on either side, give that a little squeeze, and they're pretty rusted in there. There you go. I gave it just a little bit of a twist and that came out. That's one. Give a squeeze and a little bit of a twist. There's 2. And a twist. There's 3. And there's 4. So there's our clips out. Now these are probably going to be in there pretty tight. There's a couple different ways you can do this. You could take a large socket that's larger than this cup, put it there, set it on top, and then use a brass drift to pound them through. I've got a small press over here, just a Harbor Freight special. I don't do anything industrial. That's probably going to be my best bet. Let me try to come up with a good solution, and I'll bring the camera back up when I'm ready to press. All right, so we're going to go ahead and use my hydraulic press for this. We've got this bearing puller that's opened up just large enough for my cup to fit through. Just so happens that the piston on my press is exactly the right size to fit in there. Otherwise I could have put a socket in there. I've got some old cheap sockets that are really good for these kind of little, when you need a little bit of a spacer or something. But this is all set up, and this should, hypothetically, there it goes, I just heard it pop. And there it is, it's pressing right through now. You can see this yoke is starting to move as it's pressing through. And we'll go until that cap should come out the bottom side. Okay, let's see what we got going on here. Let's loosen this up. We'll lift this off. I just used a stool back there to support the back of the drive shaft so it wouldn't fall. And there we go. There's one, and there's two. I don't know. Yep, you were able to see that. So there's that right there. Okay, came apart. You can see this thing just completely disintegrated. I'll give you a better idea of what these cups are supposed to look like next to one that's worn out. Wow, this thing is done. That's impressive. Okay, let's go ahead and set this up and do the other side. Pass this back through. Line that up so that the cup fits perfectly with this gap on my bearing puller. Alright, so now we're getting close. This all lined up. And you can see it's starting to press through right there. Nice and clean, just the way it's supposed to. And it's through. Alrighty. Take this out. Pull that cap off, and that baby comes out just like that. Alright, let's take this over to the bench, get it cleaned up, and compare old and new. Alright, so here we are with an old versus new comparison. Here's a new one. Obviously, I mean, besides just the fact that it's clean, if you look inside of here, you've got these little roller bearings that are well greased. You've got a nice little oil seal right there. If you look at this, it's a nice clean surface other than the grease on it, nice and machined and uniform. And you come to the old one over here, these two ends kind of have roller bearings in them. You can kind of see it. They're caked in really old grease. This one, if you can see it, the light's not the best. Has roller bearings, but it started to actually go a little bit dry. This side has no bearings in it whatsoever. This side, not only does it not have any bearings in it, you can actually see how it's starting to wear oblong on this side. And it was vibrating so badly it blew right through the cap on the other. Also, this side is fairly uniform and machined. Same here. You can see how badly coned this is. This end is completely beveled off. This side is also starting to do the same thing, although not so bad. This was definitely, well, none of them are good. That was the worst. That's also not so good. So what I've done is we've got the yokes here. I went ahead and I cleaned them up. Just took just with that same penetrating oil that I used and a clean rag. I looked really closely to see if there's any pitting from corrosion. And you can see they're actually nice and clean. If there's any pitting, you could take some light sandpaper or some emery cloth and clean them up real nice. These are actually in pretty good shape, amazingly, for how bad that U-joint was banging around in there. But these are good, nice and clean. They shouldn't need any cleaning up. Alright, so we're back here getting ready to put this thing back together. So you saw when we disassembled this universal joint, we used the press. And the press by far is the best way of getting this thing apart. But if you don't have a press, there's a couple other options that you can use. One involves a C-clamp. and a couple cheap sockets, or you can always break down and use the whole hammer. So if we were taking this apart, the press is obviously the best way. It provides the most pressure. Sometimes if these are real corroded or extra dirty and you just can't get them cleaned up, the C-clamp doesn't provide enough pressure to break loose a little bit of corrosion. And when you're doing that, sometimes the percussive shock of a hammer will help break that loose. So without a press, C-clamp is my next best choice. But if you can't get it with a C-clamp because of dirt or corrosion, then sometimes you have to break it out with a hammer. So what I'm going to do is when I reassemble this, I'm going to use these two different methods to demonstrate them. That way you know how they work, because putting it together is essentially exactly the same as taking it apart. But this way you can see a couple different options if you don't have a press. So to put this together, we're going to do this yoke portion first. So what you want to do is you want to put the new C-clip inside. You'll notice there's this groove that's right in here. I went ahead and took my Dremel with a little wire wheel and I cleaned this groove out to make sure it's going to go together nice and smooth. You take your C-clip, grab these two ends and squeeze it together. By squeezing it together, it reduces the diameter of that and it allows you to get it in there and right into that groove. And you want to make sure that it's in the groove all the way around and you haven't come loose anywhere. Go ahead and put one end together like that. That way, as we're putting the U-joint in, as you're tapping it into place or squeezing into place with a C-clamp, you know when it bottoms out, when it hits that C-clamp, it hasn't gone too far. It's just a good stopping point when you're putting the new one together. So with the universal joint, it's not unusual for an aftermarket, even some manufacturers, especially in the older days, to have a grease fitting or a zert fitting on one side here, so you can from time to time, like when you do an oil change, you can hook up a grease gun and squirt some new grease in there. Unfortunately, with this one, because this U-joint sits inside of this shroud, there's no way to even get a grease gun on it. It sits all the way out here. You wouldn't be able to service this anyway. But for that shield, I would set this up so it faces the easiest direction to get a grease gun onto it. But again, since we don't have since that shroud covers this whole thing up, you can't get to it. It's kind of irrelevant. These things anymore, the tolerances and everything and the grease that's used from the manufacturer is good enough that the grease fitting is almost irrelevant. So what we're going to do is we'll pull one cap off, make sure the little needle bearings stay in place. We're going to pass this up in there like so, get this lined up with a hole, put the cap back on it, just like that. Okay, want to make sure this is nice and straight. And then you can take your C-clamp. Direction is fairly irrelevant. I'm going to do it this way. Go on here and crank this guy down. So it's nice and straight. This got a pretty good start in there. If this doesn't start in there as deeply as this one did, you want to make sure it's going perfectly straight. If it's cocked off one way or another, it'll get bound up inside of this journal and it'll get jammed up and you'll be in a real big mess. You see with this C-clamp, and that one's fighting me. And I think it's this bottom one here that's hanging me up. There it goes. Now it started. Go back to our C-clamp. Now, since this is flush with the edge and this foot is larger than the diameter of that, you can back this open some. Take a cheap socket, one that you don't care about. Sure you got a nice straight pull on it. Sometimes it takes 3 hands, a little bit of patience. You can hear it working its way in. Staying nice and straight. You hear it going through. You see we're not quite to the clip there, and there's still not quite enough of a groove there for you to get the other clip in. You take your socket, tap the rest of the way. Okay, we should be far enough. You can see that groove all the way around. We should be able to get this clip in here. There we go. You want to look. See if you can see it in the camera. Yeah, I want to make sure that this clip is fully engaged into that groove all the way around. Sometimes that C-clamp method works real slick and sometimes not so much. This time it didn't work so well. These tolerances were just tight enough that I wasn't able to get it with a C-clamp, but you got the general idea for how that's supposed to work. Now we'll repeat that on the other side. Okay, we'll start with a spring clip on one side. Make sure it's in the groove all the way around. Flip. Okay, that's all the way in. We should be able to get this clip on the other side. And there we go. Once again, you want to make sure that it's engaged all the way around. You don't have any spot where it's starting to hang out. I'll show you what that would look like. Maybe. Zoom this in a little bit. Here you can clearly see where this edge of the ring isn't fully engaged into the groove. Now it is popped right in the way it's supposed to. Okay, with all of that done, we're ready to put this thing back together. Okay, one of the other things that I like to do is I've got a tap and die set. I always like to take a tap and die to the threads of these kinds of fasteners, especially if it's a powertrain issue where I'm going to be torquing my fasteners. You can see the difference. The 4 on the bottom I've run a tap or a die over, and the 4 on the top I have not yet. You can see the difference. All the gunk and corrosion and stuff that's built up on these has been nice and cleaned off. Now if you don't have a tap and die set, it's not a big deal. You can use a wire wheel or a wire brush. Get the same effect. This is just a little bit faster and a little bit cleaner. So that's something I do. I ran a die over these, and I'm going to run a tap through the yokes to clean them out as well before I assemble this, just to make sure that these will torque down correctly. Alright, so we've got the drive shaft back in. I'm going to demonstrate the tightening and torquing on the front because it's the only side you can see very clearly. On the back side, there we go. See, I've got this one already hooked up, and that heat shield is put back in place, but it's already torqued down. So here on the front where you can see it more easily, you'll notice I went ahead, I've got all 4 bolts in, and I've just got it snugged up. And you want to make sure that, get this thing to focus, there we go, that where this flange on the yoke meets the takeoff flange from the front end, you want to make sure that's pulled up nice and tight, that there's no gap. Let's see if I can see it better from this side. Some light on here. That's better. So you can see that the two flanges, the yoke and the takeoff flange, are nice and snug. 360 degrees. You can see that I've lined up my index marks. Let me get this ratchet off of here and give it a spin. There's my old index marks. Make sure I line that up both front and rear. But you can see this flange is nice and tight right here. There's no gap at all. So I snugged up all the way around all four, which means now it's time to go ahead and torque them down. The book says to torque it down to 65 to 88, which is kind of a large range. That's foot-pounds, not inch-pounds. 65 to 88 foot-pounds. And in this case, I want to go towards the top side. So I set my torque wrench to 85. We'll get these torqued down. I'll go around twice, making sure I get each fastener a second time to make sure it hasn't kind of settled in or squeezed into place. And you tighten up the last one and the first one's come loose a little bit. So we'll get this torqued down and we'll take this thing for a test drive. Alright, so we just finished putting the new U-joint on the front drive shaft for my 2001 Ford Expedition XLT. Everything went fine. Nothing too tricky. Would have been nice to have a lift, but is what it is. Just took it for a test drive, got it up to 75 on the interstate, smooth as silk, at least for a 22-year-old truck. So no complaints. So if you have any questions or any input, something I could have done different or better, just leave a comment down below, and I appreciate it. You all have a wonderful, blessed day.